Good morning. A stormy end to a stormy week. Two institutions which have helped shape the sense of Britishness in our time, the royal family and the BBC, are in some trouble. In the end, both depend on the goodwill of the British public. We'll be talking about that today, but we won't be losing sight of the fact that for much of the British public, other things. Will we be able to fly away on holiday this year? Will we really get our freedoms back next month? Feel just as urgent. We'll do our best. I'm joined this morning by the Minister responsible for our borders, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, by Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Symonds, and by Dr Jenny Harries. As Deputy Chief Medical Officer, she was one of the government's most senior advisors during the pandemic, and she's now in charge of the body designed to make sure it never happens again, the UK Health Security Agency. As the people at the top of the BBC wake up to another set of bad headlines, I'll be speaking to one of the BBC's most famous stars of the last 30 years and someone who worked closely with Princess Diana, Dame Esther Rantzen. Reviewing the news this morning, our very own political correspondent and presenter Chris Mason and the GMB presenter and author Kate Garraway. But first, the news headlines with Sally Nugent.
Good morning. 2 doses of the main COVID vaccines used in the UK are found to be highly effective against the Indian variant of the virus. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, described the findings by Public Health England as groundbreaking and said he was increasingly confident the government is on track for the final stage of its roadmap out of lockdown. The former BBC journalist Martin Bashir has defended his Panorama interview with Princess Diana, but apologised to Princes William and Harry. In an interview with the Sunday Times, Mr Bashir admitted he was wrong to have forged bank statements to obtain the interview, but said it had no bearing on subsequent events. There was frustration for the organisers of the Glastonbury Festival. Thousands of people who bought tickets for an online concert were unable to view the show for more than 2 hours due to technical issues. And a disappointing night for Great Britain at Eurovision.
0 points. I'm sorry.
It was nil point for the UK once again as Italy claimed the big prize. Meanwhile, Phil Mickelson has been eyeing a different prize. He stands on the verge of golfing history. He leads heading into the final round of the PGA Championship and at the age of 50 could become the sport's oldest major winner. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks. Now, the papers, and there is a palpable sense of optimism this morning about the virus and the jab efficiency against it. There's the Mail on Sunday, Minister, jab beats variant. The Sunday People, vaccines do work on variants. The Sunday Telegraph, vaccines effective against the Indian variant. But there is, of course, another story. On the vaccine story, a much more hostile kind of splash by the Sunday Times, focusing on Dominic Cummings' tweets over the last 48 hours. He's, of course, going in front of select committees on Wednesday. The herd immunity was the UK policy, he says, and we'll be talking about that later in the programme. The other story is, of course, the BBC and the dreadful couple of days we have had here. The Observer, we must act to tackle appalling failures at the BBC, warns ministers. The Jackson family, shame on BBC and Bashir. Shameless Bashir, says someone saying. And so that's the end of it. But we've also had that very interesting interview with Martin Bashir in the Sunday Times, and I'm sure we'll mention that in the course of the programme. So let's start, if we could, Kate, with the vaccine news. This is data from Public Health England, and it's really good.
It's really good, isn't it? What is it, 88%? I think the Pfizer, 2 doses of the Pfizer gives protection against the Indian variant. Others are 60 plus, which doesn't sound good, but actually that is about as good as vaccines get. And I think what's great about it is that this time last week, when we had surge testing in Bolton and other places, it had that terrible feeling that we had at the end of last year with the Kent variant, that we could see a chance of freedom on the horizon slipping away because there were concerns. This now means that actually, if you've had your 2 doses, the Indian variant doesn't present a new problem because it is as effective
though
as
it is spreading quite fast, isn't it? It's spreading around the country, so it's there.
It's there. The Indian variant is there. It's frightening, and but I think what is unclear at the moment is, yes, it looks like it's more spreadable, but is it more deadly? And what we know from the vaccine is that you're protected against it, and the vaccine appears to reduce the impact of symptoms. So even if you still get it, you're not likely to be as seriously affected or hospitalized, which is where we want to move to, isn't it? So it feels positive, although we all still have to be cautious.
Crossed fingers, crossed toes all round. Chris, we talk about the end of all the restrictions on June the 21st, which we're hoping will happen. I think a lot of people may have forgotten what the restrictions are that we are talking about. What we'll be able to do on June the 22nd we can't do now.
Well, the crucial line that is in that document published back in February by the government, and which so far every date has been stuck to, is that June the 21st would be the removal of all the remaining legal limits on social contact. Now, that's subject to some reviews that are still going on. I was speaking to someone in government last night. They say that those reviews are on time. They'll be published in roughly a week to 10 days. There was a bit of a wobble, wasn't there, as Kate mentioned, 10 days or so ago, from the Prime Minister publicly suggesting that maybe June the 21st wouldn't happen on time. Maybe these reviews will be delayed as well. Looks like the reviews will come on time, and all of the language in the papers this morning hints at optimism, albeit with the caveat that we haven't yet got data around hospitalisation on the Indian variant because there hasn't been the timeline yet.
So this means hugging, kissing, going to other people's houses. It means football matches back. It means music festivals. It means all life as normal returns.
In theory, it means normality, but with an asterisk just attached above that Y, because of these reviews and the potential that there could be some elements that are retained. Some people talk about the prospect of face masks on public transport, for instance, but pretty much normality.
At this point, Kate, I have to ask you about Derek Draper, your husband. He's had an absolutely appalling time with COVID. He's back at home now. First of all, you've written a book about this. How is he now?
So he came home on April the 7th, so we're a few weeks into it now. How is he? I mean, look, he is devastated by COVID. He can't really move. His communication is very minimal. There are moments when there's up. So therefore, in those moments, you feel that he's in there. He has a lot of memory, but the accessing of it is very limited. So how is he? He's a long way from the Derek Draper that you know, Andrew.
Well, listen,
but he's home and he's alive.
Give him all our love, Kate.
Now.
Give him all of our love and all of our very best wishes. You mentioned long COVID just now. There's a couple of stories in the papers about long COVID, in fact.
There are, isn't there? And that's one of the things, when we have this kind of incredible joy that we all want to feel about the extraordinary skill of the scientists to give us vaccines to protect future infections, I think there's a growing group of people who weren't able to benefit from that and caught COVID before that hope was there, that are worried about being forgotten. A couple of very interesting stories. Story in The Observer about GPs. Now, there have been lots of health professionals that have been affected by COVID, and long COVID is a big umbrella term which affects people in lots of ways. Lots of people nowhere near as badly as Derek. It's fatigue, it's brain fog that they have. And they're finding that their contracts as GPs are only 6 months, 9 months, or in some cases 12 months. So they can't return to work full time and they're losing their positions. Now, of course, we don't really want our doctors to have brain fog when we go in and see them at the GP, do we? So you can see why they're trying not to do it. And this will be across all industries. People will find it hard to return to work, and we have to somehow support those people in a time of huge crisis financially, but is going to be a big problem. So while we are winning, hopefully, against the pandemic and new infections, we have a big problem with people that are already infected, like people like Derek, who still need care. And then another interesting story, although I wonder if the statistics may not be entirely clear. is this risk of long COVID lung damage in women. Now, it's a third likely that if you got COVID seriously and you're a woman, you're a third more likely to still be suffering a year on. And that seems extraordinary, because I can remember when Derek was first sick, women were coming out of it much better. In fact, two very senior doctors said to me, if I could do something right now, this was back in April 2020, I would give everybody in the country estrogen, because we don't know why, but women do not seem to be getting as sick. But what seemed to be happening is they didn't get as sick initially, but this is the mystery. Later. Well, it's the mystery of how COVID affects the body, that the problems come further on down the line.
Kate, thanks very much indeed for that. Now, I mentioned the Dominic Cummings story. How worried do you think the establishment, the government, is about those few hours in front of a select committee, which I'm sure you will be covering on Wednesday? The
phrase elephant in the room of the government's week was used to me last night. So this is going to be the dynamite moment of the next couple of days at Westminster. Wednesday, him appearing in front of these two select committees looking into all things COVID. And we know that Dominic Cummings' instinct when he sees an institution is to want to put explosive underneath it and then immediately detonate. And his argument, he's given us quite an assembly and amuse-bouche of tweets over the best part of the last week, setting out his argument. He thinks the government was far, far too slow in locking down in the first place. He argues that it was government policy to have so-called herd immunity until the government was talked out of it. They flatly deny that.
To remind people, that would mean allowing lots and lots of people to catch COVID until you got to the stage where so many people had caught it that it was no longer spreading around the community.
Yeah, that was the theory, with the exception that the most vulnerable would be ring-fenced. And his argument is that was government policy until scientists said that it would be absolutely devastating as far as the death toll is concerned. The government repeatedly make the argument that is wrong, and the word lie is thrown around on both sides. And the government makes the argument in the end there will be the inquiry and that all of this should be flushed out then. It's
going to be quite a moment. Everyone's going to be asking how much actual evidence does he have. Let's turn to the BBC, Kate, as one of the people present who's not in the BBC. It's a pretty miserable day for the BBC, looking at headlines across the patch. But perhaps the most interesting single piece of new journalism is the interview with the Sunday Times and Martin Bashir, in which he defends that now notorious interview very robustly.
He does. It's not my own interview. It's a fascinating interview to read. I mean, you know, I don't work for the BBC currently. I have done, and I do work for ITV, which is another part of public sector broadcasting. And I just feel very sad for the thousands of BBC journalists that work so hard to be accurate, to be honourable. And when I read this interview, I mean, clearly Martin Bashir is in trauma. He's in shock. I don't think he is quite sunk into him, actually, the true damage he's done. And I was surprised not to see more personal responsibility on that. So his arguments are that Diana would have done the interview anyway. Well, we don't actually know that, because she died not knowing that those statements were false. Yeah. And she talks very movingly about the friendship they had, but doesn't seem to understand that the friendship was based on a lie. And that is the fundamental trust that you can't, that was broken. The damage is terrible for William and Harry. The damage is terrible for the royal family. But he doesn't seem to understand the damage it's done on trust in the profession of journalism at the moment. I think that's because he's in shock, Andrew. I think he's in shock. He's fighting for himself. Yes. Maybe he'll come to. But I don't think it's helped the BBC or indeed the profession, because people will read that and think, I'm afraid he's making excuses. Making excuses. And, of course, we don't yet know what the effect on the BBC itself is going to be, whether ministers are going to want a tougher governance coming in.
Quite. And it's striking reading the papers. I mean, you could wallpaper my front room several times over with all of the analyses, and particularly the questions about the decision to rehire Mr Bashir, 5 or 6 years ago, after a couple of decades of the whole thing curdling, and rehiring amid glutinous praise from BBC executives at the time. What's striking, I think, when you read the papers, from the government perspective, is that there's one or two lurid quotes, but on the whole, they seem relatively measured in terms of reaction, albeit saying that perhaps with the mid-term review of the Charter, that might be a time to look at governance, particularly given the kind of language we heard from Prince William the other night.
Now, we have a long tradition on the paper review of this programme of introducing a note of extreme surrealism towards the end. So I'm going to ask both of you, Chris and Kate, whether you watched Eurovision last night, and was it entirely for the Graham Norton commentary like me?
Oh, we all love Graham Norton. It was also because I was determined to make my kids watch it. I was like, this is a part of our culture. You must watch it, because, of course, they see it as utterly irrelevant to the music they listen to. They liked James's entry and then just were horrified and feel that we've entirely, we've been robbed.
You said...
I don't know whether they're now going to watch Eurovision more or not. But yeah, we were robbed.
Kate, at the risk of getting myself into terrible trouble, I'm not absolutely sure that we were robbed, I have to say, but a really surreal and extraordinary moment.
Well,
Chris?
Well, I listened to quite a bit of it on the radio, and I found myself thinking, Andrew, is it a bit like the analyses you got of a generation ago around American presidential debates? Do you come away with a different impression if you listen on the radio and Ken Bruce's commentary versus Graham Norton on the telly? And I think you do, because you're spared the choreography, the ludicrous costumes, and just listening to the music, which for some of the songs can be an advantage, and perhaps for others a little less.
Chris, I'm slightly worried that you're making a case for the wireless rather than for television. I can't think why you in particular would be doing that, but thanks to you and to Kate very much indeed for the paper review. And so to the weather. There is nothing on this little green planet quite as depressing as a cold, wet English summer day. We've had lots of those. Enough already. It's no longer funny in England or anywhere else. For goodness sake, Sarah Keith-Lucas in the weather studio, give us something to look forward to, please.
Oh, well, Andrew, I can give you something to look forward to. In fact, things are looking a bit drier and a little bit warmer through the week and as we head towards the bank holiday weekend. So just bear with the weather for a few more days, because it is still quite unsettled. We've still got low pressure. Bit of sunshine in the east today, but we've got rain that's working its way west to east, all courtesy of the latest area of low pressure. Quite an active cold front here, so that's pushing rain across Northern Ireland. Some heavy rain arriving a little bit later on through Wales, southwest England, western Scotland as well. But I think northern and eastern Scotland and right down towards the southeast of England, perhaps one or two showers, but quite a bit of dry weather with some spells of hazy sunshine lasting through the day. 13 or 14 degrees towards the east, but under that heavy rain in the west with some squally winds as well, only about 10 or 11. Now, into this evening and overnight, eventually that wet weather pushes across all of the UK, clearing away from the east coast, but lingering across parts of Scotland, and clear spells and further showers tonight. But it's going to be another fairly chilly night with temperatures down into mid-single figures. Through Monday, low pressure brings us another day of sunshine and showers for England and Wales, some more rain for Scotland and for Northern Ireland too. But things do look to be turning a bit warmer and drier as we head through this week. Andrew.
Well, thanks for those last few phrases, Sarah, at least. Now, returning to the subject we've just been talking about, the BBC, the Dyson Report, Martin Bashir and Princess Diana, you might have assumed we would have a voice from the BBC itself to respond to all the unanswered questions. You might have expected that. So did we. But, as it turns out, no dice. Instead, I've been speaking to Dame Esther Rantzen, who knew the Princess well at the time and was also one of the BBC's most famous faces. And I began by asking her if she agrees with Earl Spencer that a direct line can be drawn from that Martin Bashir interview to the breakdown of the Princess's marriage and then to her death.
I think it's understandable, but no, I don't think it is fair. What we have to remember is that 3 years previously, Diana had collaborated with the book, what was really an autobiography, talking about her suffering and her private life. She had spoken to other people, for example, Jenny Bond, saying more or less exactly what she said in that interview. They were separated at the time of the interview, Prince Charles and she were, and I think they had made each other very, very unhappy. And for evidence, one only has to look at the passionate and enduring relationship, the love affair that became a marriage between Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. So I think they would certainly have divorced. I also think that her tragic death was due to the ferocious pursuit by the press and paparazzi.
You knew her during the course of this period when she was, as it were, the quarry. What do you remember about the pressure on her at the time yourself?
Well, I remember no paranoia I think paranoia is a term people usually use for people that invent persecution or have delusions of it. What I saw was a woman who was carrying on working. I knew her because, for example, she launched Childline's 10th birthday appeal. So what I saw was a talented, determined young woman, really in her prime, in her mid-30s.
So I think one of the big puzzles in all of this, Esther, is the rehiring of Martin Bashir in 2016 after there had been lots of arguments about his previous work. What's your explanation of that?
Well, 2020 hindsight, very useful. Of course, what the BBC was dealing with was the results of the internal inquiry, which had said he was honourable and honest. And given that verdict, you couldn't very well say, well, we can't employ him in any role, because it was Tony Hall, who I think is honourable and honest, and therefore tends to see it in other people, who had come to that conclusion. And he had become Director General, so it was difficult to gainsay. But I do think there are other people who need to be asking questions, and one of them is Lord Burt, John Burt, because he was Director General at a time this interview was being prepared and transmitted. And loads of the checks and balances that John Burt was brought into the BBC to put on to BBC journalism didn't seem to have been used in order to protect the BBC from experiencing what I call scoop frenzy.
Now, so far, and I say so far, the only people who've lost their jobs inside the BBC over all of this have been the whistleblowers. Do you think that's right?
It happens so often. It happens in the health service. It happens in all these big organisations. And I was talking to Nick Ross, who has a very interesting role on one of the big health authorities. He is the Freedom to Speak Out Guardian, and he's on their non-executive. In other words, he's even higher than the most senior executives. And if there are people who want to whistleblow, they have guardians at their level who then alert him, and he takes it as high as it will go. Now, one of the awful things about this story is Steve Hewlett, who actually ran the BBC's media show and was widely regarded in his later life as a journalist, actually more or less sacked the two whistleblowers who came to see him, made sure they didn't stay on Panorama, when in fact, of course, he should have taken what they said higher up the organisation, and obviously what they said should have gone to the Board of Governors and never did.
Looking back on what's happened, do you think the BBC needs to change?
Well, I do think having a freedom to speak out guardian on whatever the highest level of governance is, whether it's in Ofcom or whether it's within the BBC, it has to be above and separate from the executive. Because what I call scoop syndrome, which I've experienced, and I'm sure you've experienced, when all common sense and judgment goes out the window and you just pound after your prey, can blind you to some of the issues. And the person who says no in any office is always the least popular. So it has to be someone right up in the stratosphere of the BBC that does that.
Esther, you have seen and worked for the BBC in good times and in less good times. This is clearly a terrible, terrible morning for the BBC. Do you think this one's going to blow over?
Yes, I do. I hope so. And I think it should, because in the end of the day, I believe the Princess of Wales said what she wanted to say to a very wide audience, who therefore understood a great deal more about her suffering and why, in the end, she left the royal family. And I see the same syndrome happening in the next generation. And I think the BBC needs to continue to report fairly, unsensationally, and keep a cool head, even when the brickbats are flying, because the BBC is much bigger than this.
Cool heads all round. Dame Esther Rantzen, thanks so much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Now, throughout most of the pandemic, Dr Jenny Harries advised the government as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Earlier this year, she took over as Chief Executive of the Test and Trace System, and she also runs the UK Health Security Agency, a body set up to protect us all from future pandemics. I spoke to her just before we came on air this morning, and I asked her what the latest data shows us about how well the vaccines work on the B.1.617 variant that first appeared in India.
the layman's terms, I think it means very good news. What this study that PHE have published and colleagues in universities have shown is that we now have the first real world evidence of vaccine effectiveness against the B617.2, the variant which first arose in India. And what it's showing is that these are just as effective after 2 doses as they have been against the Kent variant.
Now, it's a moving picture, of course, but is the Indian variant now the dominant strain, do you think?
So it's a bit of a mixed picture across the country. If you look in areas such as Bolton and Bedford, for example, in the northwest particularly, it's starting to become the dominant strain and taken over from the Kent variant, which has been our predominant one for over the winter months. But that's not the case right across the country, actually. So if you're down in the southwest, that's still not the case.
Returning to this new data, the AstraZeneca jab is only 60% effective after 2 doses. And I wonder, therefore, whether people who've had those 2 doses are going to need a booster jab, a 3rd dose.
So I think there are 2 different things here. There's whether we all need a 3rd dose potentially as we move into the autumn, and we're not quite at that decision point yet. But I think importantly, the different vaccines were given to slightly different groups of people. So, for example, the Pfizer vaccine was rolled out initially because it had to be kept at ultra low temperatures to, for example, healthcare workers who tended to be younger. This is an all-age study, whereas the AstraZeneca one went out to older groups of individuals who were less able to come into main centres. So I think we shouldn't be concluding that at this stage. Both of these vaccines are really good. I'm going for my 2nd AstraZeneca jab soon, and I think we'll get more refinement of that data as we go forward. So just a straightforward message is get your 2nd dose.
And of course, we're really interested, all of us, in hospitalisations and severe illness as a result of this. When will we have the data on that?
Yeah, so fortunately, we're not seeing much. So this is a good thing, but of course it means the data will come through more slowly. We're watching that very carefully. So the data, there's a technical briefing that the public can access on gov.uk website, which shows that up to the 19th of May, we had only had 6 deaths. Now, they're obviously very sad for those individuals, but vast majority of these are people who have not been vaccinated and also elderly. And so, you know, from that perspective, it's looking very good. It's still quite early days, and we will be familiar with waiting for about 2 weeks after a surge in cases for hospitalisations, and then another 2 weeks for deaths. But so we will just have to wait and see. But at the moment, we're not seeing reductions in effectiveness in serious disease or deaths. And in fact, I think we're feeling increasingly confident that that will be the case.
Can I ask you about another crucial question, which is, of course, transmissibility of the new variant? At one point, SAGE was suggesting it might be 50% more infectious, but there are also suggestions it might be at the lower end of the scale at about 20%. Do you have any more information on that?
So I think the jury is still out, and you will see my old Deputy CMO colleague, Jonathan Van Tam, I think the other day, was saying it's somewhere between 1 and 2% and up to 50%. But I think most people feel that it is somewhere in the middle of that range.
Do you think that we are absolutely now on track for the end of all the restrictions on the 21st of June?
So fortunately, the roadmap is not my personal decision, but I think it's looking good if people are continuing to observe all of the safety signals. So, you know, we should not stop doing what we're doing, particularly in areas where we have that variant of concern, the B617.2 in the northwest and around London. Really important that people continue to do hand, space, and ventilate. You know, work from home, have their jabs. Absolutely, we've heard today, 2nd vaccination really important, and go for tests as well. I mean, the cases of the 617.2 are rising. They have risen very steeply. Much of the media has reported 160% rise in cases over a week period. But they seem to be slightly leveling a little at the moment, but it's still very early days.
So in simple terms, you're on SAGE still. Do you agree with those SAGE colleagues who are urging caution about the 21st of June?
Absolutely. I think we all need to be very cautious, and I think we all don't want to go back to the sorts of lockdowns that we've had. It doesn't matter whether you're on stage or out in the public carrying on your normal life. None of us want to return to that sort of restriction.
There's another new variant being discovered in North Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. How many cases of that have you found, and is that something of concern?
So this is the VUI called AV.1. So a VUI is a variant under investigation. That means that it has been spotted to have particular mutations that can be associated with adverse outcomes, if you like. So it might be more susceptible to be more transmissible or counter some of the immune response that we'd normally produce. But actually there hasn't been yet any signal from that VUI that it's a particular problem. There are 49 cases currently mostly focused around Yorkshire and Humber, and that too has been spotted in a couple of other places across the world. But I think all of these variants under investigation are there for us to keep monitoring them, just as we have with the ones that have progressed to a variant of concern, and we will continue to do that.
Now, everyone, I'm sure, is looking forward to Dominic Cummings' evidence on Wednesday in front of those select committees. You were Deputy Advisor to the government at the time. Can I take you back to December last year and ask you, did you advise the government then to cancel Christmas and stop people across the country meeting in each other's homes or not?
So you can probably see from my facial movements, I'm trying to go back. That seems a long way away now. Obviously, it will have been for ministers to make decisions on the evidence that was there. I think generally public health colleagues are always cautious about people meeting in houses, but I think what happened at Christmas time was that there was a recognition many people would actually meet up anyway. I think simply because Christmas is Christmas, and we always have to recognise behaviour within all of our guidance as well. But certainly the guidance that went out was clearly to restrict people's interactions for their own benefits, to try and make sure that they limited the number of people that they saw, and that felt appropriate at the time.
So I'm not clear whether you gave advice that shouldn't happen or not. Do you think it was a mistake that we did not meet, that we did meet up so much at Christmas?
I think at the time, I mean, I personally would not give the advice directly as such, Andrew. So sorry, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think generally public health advice, of which I would have contributed, was that we need to limit, when we have large numbers of cases around, obviously we need to limit our social interactions, and we still need to do that now if we possibly can.
So that sounds like it was a mistake. When did you first see evidence about how severe the death toll was likely to be in January?
So I don't think we can say that was a mistake. I think, as I've pointed out, we have to take into consideration what the prevalence of disease is, but also people's behaviours. We know that people have been suffering a lot. They've been very challenged by the restrictions that have been put in place. So it's very much a balance between the epidemiology and taking people with us. And the public have been absolutely brilliant in following the guidance as we've gone through the pandemic. And I think that happened over Christmas. People were very careful to limit the numbers of interactions they had and to do that as safely as possible. So I'm not suggesting the guidance was a mistake. I think we always have a balanced position when we're providing advice. And as I say, fortunately, we provide the epidemiology, and ministers will take those decisions.
And yet we saw a very severe spike coming afterwards. I know these decisions are really difficult, and I'm not trying to be silly about it, but do you think it was a mistake not to have locked down earlier than the 4th of January?
So I think when we look back through the pandemic, there will be a number of things that we can see with hindsight we could do. But I just go back to the point that I've made, that this isn't simply about epidemiology. It is very much about behaviours. And in fact, you will see that advice from SAGE has what we call SPI-M, which is the scientific group on modelling, feeding in, and SPI-B, which is the behavioural group, and both of those are equally important. Now,
the central assertion by Mr Cummings is that herd immunity by September was the government's official plan A right until March. Was that true?
So I can categorically say I have never been in any government meeting where herd immunity was put forward as at that point in the pandemic as a mechanism for control. And I think it's really important for viewers to understand what we mean by herd immunity, because actually what we're doing with the vaccine, which everybody is very supportive of, is developing herd immunity. What we're saying is when you have a population which has a high level of immune response to the virus, then once we get it up to about 90%, somewhere around there across the whole population, then the virus hasn't got anywhere to go. And in fact, if you look at the data now and the technical report which PHE have just produced, our current immunity across the population overall is about 71%, and about 15, nearly 16% of that has come from natural infection, and the rest of it, which of course is building rapidly, is coming from vaccination. So I think just talking about herd immunity is a rather simplistic way of looking at what is going to be a benefit from the vaccination.
That is where we are now, and we're now in a much, much better position. But rewinding to last year, Dominic Cummings says that herd immunity was on all graphs, on all documents, it was discussed in meetings. Is that simply not true?
So I haven't been in any of those meetings, but bear in mind I would not have been in most of the high-level ones as the Deputy CMO. But I think, as I say, being really clear what we mean by herd immunity, what you're looking at in a population is to try and see at which point your population would be safe. And exactly as I say, this is what we're doing with this very successful vaccination programme that we have. That's not the same as saying, which I think has been misinterpreted in many places, that the aim would be to allow people to become infected and develop herd immunity. That has never been on the agenda, but you will always look to see how safe you can get your population through a vaccination programme. And in fact, of course, one of the reasons we've been so successful is that people considered vaccines very early on and invested very early on a number of different vaccines, which of course is why we've got such good population immunity developing now.
The country was slow at the beginning to act. I mean, we ended up with one of the highest relative death rates in the world and a very, very severe economic knock. I'm just wondering, looking out there for the next wave, the next pandemic, the next disease coming, how different we have to be next time as a government and as a country.
So, yeah, so I mean, I think on the mortality statistics, we do need to wait right until the end of all of this, because we are very good at counting things in this country, sometimes to our detriment, I think. But undoubtedly, there are lots of lessons to learn, and we would not wish to see, I think, such an impact again. And so having that very early surveillance, working with global partners across the world in a real-time data sharing opportunities, I think, is the way to go forward. And then what we're doing is we're picking up that disease early. We're supporting countries that perhaps don't have quite the same level of genomic surveillance to detect pathogens as they're emerging, and that will help both us and other countries as well.
Dr Jenny Harries, let's hope that life in the Health Security Agency is relatively calm in the next few years. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And listening to that is the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who joins me now in the studio. Priti Patel, we'll talk about the pandemic later on. But good morning. Let me start with the BBC and the Bashir row. The sons of Princess Diana draw a pretty clear line between that highly controversial interview, the breakdown of her marriage, and then her death. Do you agree with them?
Well, Andrew, I think, first of all, it's utterly heartbreaking, actually, when you hear members of the royal family and, in fact, the Duke of Cambridge and Sussex speaking out in very personal terms about their mother, and it is heartbreaking. But also coming back to what is going on right now with the Dyson report that has been published, this is a really, really significant moment of reflection, I think, for the BBC. There is no doubt this world-class institution, its reputation has been highly damaged. I would have thought, actually, members of the British public, but even around the world right now, watching what has happened would clearly be asking the questions. Where is the BBC? The leadership of the BBC at this moment in time. Why aren't they, out there publicly giving confidence and building confidence in terms of the publication of this report? But I genuinely believe that great harm, reputation of the BBC has been damaged. Lessons will have to be learned, no question about that. And also there'll be work on regaining trust and confidence and working with the government as well going forward, looking at the midterm charter review next year.
I guess the question is what should change inside the BBC and around the BBC. Your colleague Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, said the government will consider, and I quote, whether further governance reforms at the BBC are needed in the midterm charter review, which, as you say, is next year. What kind of reforms do you think might be needed?
So absolutely, I think the Culture Secretary is absolutely right around governance, accountability, transparency. But Andrew, I think we also have to reflect, we live in the age of multimedia. The role of the BBC when it comes to its performance, where it stands in a multimedia world. This is the Netflix generation. How relevant is the BBC? Some of the cultural associations with the BBC as well. I'm sure there'll be many, many issues. But right now, I think it is important, actually, that accountability, trust and confidence, those fundamental pillars, are addressed. And Andrew, you mentioned it earlier on that, the BBC did not put anyone up this morning to even answer questions in the same way that I'm here asking questions on some of my area in the government later on. But the review has been published, the report has been published, and this is going to be a very significant and serious moment at a time when the reputation of the BBC has been compromised.
Do you like the idea, for instance, of the BBC having a further outside board overseeing the journalism? That's one thing that Michael Grade suggested.
I think all options will naturally have to be considered and looked at, and that comes down to the DNA of governance and accountability in any organisation. But we must always remember the BBC is an international organisation and institution. Very, very well known, respected and trusted, has been for decades and decades around the world. So to move on post this report, there'll be no doubt certain questions and certain elements that will be, should be reviewed, I think, with the midterm charter review next year. Very tough times for the BBC. Do you think the BBC survives this? The BBC will have to reflect and learn lessons. As within all walks of life, institutions, companies, corporations, governments, institutions, this report is significant. I think it will go down as one of those key moments in the history of the BBC, and lessons will have to be learnt from there. Now, we know that the Met Police is looking at the Dyson report and looking at the circumstances surrounding that interview. As Home Secretary, would you welcome a police investigation? I'm not going to prejudge anything, Andrew, right now. The Metropolitan Police will do what they have to do. It's not for me to cross that boundary. What I would say, though, because it's early stages yet, this report, the Dyson report, has been published, the review itself. I think it's important that all the component parts, the elements, the BBC, government as well, with the opportunities, and I think we should look at the Charter Review as an opportunity to really strengthen, bolster and enhance the governance and accountability. Should there be other issues that materialise, then I think they will have to be looked at. Let's turn to the pandemic then. Looking at the data coming out from Public Health England, really overwhelmingly positive this morning. There's no particular reason for us not to think that June the 21st remains as the day when we get our liberties back. Well, this is an important time for us all. We had May the 17th in the last week or so unlocking and people getting back and living their lives. I think we're all quite reflective right now as well over the past 12 months, how we've been locked down, the economy's shut down, and how we're now getting back to normal. And your interview with Jenny Harries show that as well. First of all, though, on this, I think the public are being very conscientious and very sensible. We've all adopted, hands, face, space, social distancing, etc., which will help, which will absolutely help. The data, obviously, and we follow the data, we listen to the advice from scientists and government. We will continue to do that. But I think at this stage, I wouldn't want to preempt anything other than to say the data is good and we all need to carry on being very conscientious in our behaviours. What we know is that despite the data this morning, the Indian variant is more transmissible and the vaccines are not quite as effective against it. Given that,
are we going to unlock on the 21st of June?
Well, we have the roadmap, and of course the roadmap has a number of tests that lead to the next stage. So we will continue to follow the data, look at those tests. Those tests are important as to how we move on to the next stage. The other point to make, Andrew, we speak about the variants of concern. Of course,
Right.
as a country...
One more time, so I'm so sorry to break in. Is the data, as we have it today, telling us that we will open up on the 21st of June or not?
The data is positive in terms of where we are, and look at the vaccine information that's been published today about the level of protection against specific variants. But that doesn't mean, of course, that, you know, it's the green light all the way. There are stages which we will follow. And again, I'd say to the British public, Andrew, who've been incredible throughout all of this, we all have to be conscientious. And, you know, all of us that are out and about now, we're distancing, wearing masks, following all the rules. That's part of our normal life now, and that will continue. And that, of course, will help us to that unlocking on the 21st of June.
Let's think about the British public who are hoping to fly away on holiday this summer. As I understand it, on the green list, there are just 3 countries people can fly to who will accept us. One of them is Iceland. One of them is very, very small. It's Gibraltar. And that leaves one. Is it really the government's policy that you can fly away for a foreign holiday, but only to Portugal?
First of all, we've been in a pandemic, and if I may say so, throughout the pandemic, we've been taking the right approaches to protect the public when it comes to public health. Now, when it comes to travel, international travel, we have the traffic light system. That is there for a reason in terms of red listing countries where we have variants, concerns, all those types of things. We have measures in place to protect the public. When it comes to holidays, of course, the public will follow the advice that comes out from the government, green listing, for example, but that's always under review. That list can change and will change.
Are you going to put more countries on the green list?
Well, I can't sit here today and say that to you. The list is constantly under review, and the next review point when that comes up, there'll be more information published. I would say to everybody, just follow the advice from government, look at which countries are listed, and just again, be very conscientious as to, you know, how we go about our lives, booking holidays, just make sure that, you know, all the information is there and that the public have the right information to make that decision.
When did you tell Boris Johnson to put India on the red list?
Well, across government, we made the decision collectively across government for red listing of India. I think it was on April the 23rd. And that was at a time when clearly we were starting to see, in fact, the variant of concern around the Indian variant became an issue of concern 6 days later. But it's also important to remember the only reason why we know about these variants of concern is because the level of genomic sequencing that we have. We have the biggest capability in the world, in the UK. And so that is how we are able to monitor variants and also put the right protective measures in place to protect the British public.
But there is still a mystery here, because Matt Hancock told me that it was the positivity rates of people coming into this country and being tested that dictated which countries went on the red list and which didn't. And at the time, Pakistan had a positivity rating of 4.6 and was put on the red list. And at the crucial period, which is 25th of March through to the 7th of April, the positivity rate for incoming travellers from India was higher than that. 5.2%. So why was Pakistan on the list and India not?
Well, you have to remember as well, there were many measures put in place at the borders even before those countries were red listed and even before the positivity rates were identified and even before the particular variant became a variant of concern. So people coming into the country were subject to upstream checks, being checked in terms of COVID tests and also having to quarantine as well. Our rules were very, very strict. But of course, Andrew, we work with the data and we do know, of course, when it comes to positivity, variants of concerns and the data, there is a lag. So we work with the system and that information was presented to ministers in the right way for the decisions to be made around red listing of all of the countries in particular.
You rightly mentioned data. What the data tells us is that the Indian variant is spreading around the country and is on course to become the dominant variant in this country. That it came in through large numbers of people coming into this country from India who were not checked properly. And that is really down to the government and down to the borders. Matt Hancock told me the positivity tests were the crucial thing. And yet India was higher on those tests than Pakistan was at the time. There is still a mystery over this.
That's not quite correct in the sense that the variant, it wasn't just India, this is Pakistan, if you also remember, Kenya and Bangladesh were also on the list.
India
and they're
wasn't.
all red listed. I emphasise again, it's not that people were not checked, that is not correct to say that.
Well,
we had plenty of checks upstream and people could not get on to an aeroplane until they'd been tested, provided certification, and in fact airlines are fined if they're not providing that information through the system. Of course, people are checked at the border as well. So there are upstream checks, in-country checks, there are managed quarantine processes as well. So people are checked and the system is in place to make sure we check. And you've also mentioned about the variant of concern in the UK. Of course, there is a great deal of work taking place in terms of testing and jabbing. And the jabbing is so important to making sure we get people protected.
I'd like to stay with the Indian variant, however, because we know there are at least 3,424 cases, and probably a lot more than that by now, of the Indian variant inside the UK now. Do you know how many of those came directly from travellers coming from India?
Well, at this stage, I don't know, but we will have that data. And it won't just be about travellers from India, because the Indian variant, of course, as I've said, neighbouring countries were also red listed because of the variant of concern as well. So government has that data. But I think importantly, when it comes to protecting our country and our public, we have all the measures in place, not just at the border, but upstream and in country. So when you look at particular communities that are affected, we have the surge testing and we have greater vaccination programmes taking place. And the information and the data published today shows, of course, that the vaccine is providing protection against this particular variant.
But this system is not working in the sense that the Indian variant came into this country and is spreading fast. Since the 15th of February, nearly 500,000 people, international arrivals, have been told to quarantine at home. Do you know how many of them went unchecked?
Well, we have checks in place for the managed quarantine service and people checking, people at home who are self-isolating at home. But
is that just a phone call?
It's not a phone call. It is a vigorous system led by Public Health England. And it is calls, it is checks. People do receive checks at home. And I think I should just...
Not many.
Well, people are receiving checks at home. I think also, Andrew, let's put this into context. The British public have been following government advice and rules throughout this pandemic. We have stepped up all checks. We do not live in a police state.
No,
we live in an open society.
Ignoring this system.
Well, actually, not when, and let's not forget, there are wider checks, not just the checks at home, but the checks that have been taken upstream, but also as people arrive in the country. And it's that information that then goes to Public Health England, which then enables the additional checks to be taken place. So I do not think it's right, and it's not the right characterisation to look at checks in isolation, one check at home,
but you don't know
and
how
no
many
further
have been
upstream.
physically checked.
We do have that data, Andrew.
So how many of that 500,000 have been physically checked?
I don't have that information here. Government does have that data. It's with Public Health England because they are the ones that see all those checks.
Going right back to the beginning of this pandemic, you wanted to close the borders very early on. Why did the Prime Minister overrule you? What reasons did he give right at the beginning?
Well, again, we follow data and the advice that comes through from the scientists, and that has determined our strategy and our policies, Andrew, from day one.
But your advice was different from the Prime Minister's view.
We can all
I want to know why he overruled you.
Well, it's not about being overruled, because all our decisions are collective decisions made across government, and those decisions are based on information that is provided to all ministers based on SAGE, based on good colleagues like Jenny and many others who effectively, as you heard from Jenny Harries today as well, say that information comes to government ministers based on data and based on taking the right and appropriate measures. And let's not forget, Andrew, back in January last year, there was advice going to the British public around travel, advice around the borders, and it's how that advice is aggregated that then leads to the collective decision-making, whether it's borders or other aspects of the pandemic that, we've all experienced and we've all been involved in.
Can you now admit as government that herd immunity was the policy until March?
Not at all, no. Absolutely not. Our policy, from the outset, Andrew, the policy and the strategy...
So why is Dominic Cummings telling us that that's true?
Well, I can't speak for Mr Cummings and one individual, but what...
So if you say it's not true, he said it was on all the graphs, it was on all the paperwork in those crucial meetings. presumably, therefore, he cannot be bringing hard evidence of this. If you say it's not
so what
true.
I would say to this, I'm not going to comment on what Mr Cummins is going to say or also what is being speculated about right now. I think it's important, and the British public will know this. Andrew, we all remember the intensity of the pandemic when the pandemic hit last year.
But I'm asking about the decision.
And the decisions that were undertaken in government. And by our Prime Minister, rightly so, collectively, he showed great leadership at a very difficult time, closing the economy down, locking the country down as well. Big, big, unprecedented decisions that were based on data and evidence. And our strategy was always about protecting public health, saving lives and protecting the NHS.
Okay,
and all colleagues, absolutely all colleagues involved in those meetings and discussions, working with the chief scientists and chief medical officers, will absolutely recognise that from the very difficult discussions that we had. And Andrew, at a time of a crisis, when government is making very, very tough decisions, difficult decisions, we put public life and protecting the public at the forefront of all those decisions.
You are found to have broken the ministerial code. The Prime Minister is under investigation over the ministerial code. Does the ministerial code still matter?
Well, look, I mean, the ministerial code itself is there for a reason, and there's work taking place right now in terms of reviewing that. Now, I think
reviewing the code.
Well, I think at this stage, you know, this isn't about breaking codes and things of that nature. We're all just getting on in government, doing very difficult jobs, actually, coming out of this pandemic. You've just asked me about decisions that were made last year, and all ministers currently are focused on getting on doing that job.
Final question. Nicola Sturgeon has asked you to stop the deportation of people from Glasgow because of community hostility to that there. Are you going to do that?
Well, the government has a responsibility to remove people from the United Kingdom with no legal status to be here.
That's a no.
And that includes some of the individuals, foreign national offenders and people that have brought great harm to our country. So we will continue to enforce our laws and legislation to remove those with no legal basis to be in the UK.
Home Secretary, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Now, I'm joined now from Cardiff, I hope, by the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds. Mr Thomas-Symonds, welcome. I'm sorry about the problems we've been having this morning. Can I ask you, first of all, what your policy of a pause on international travel actually means?
Well, firstly, good to eventually join you this morning, Andrew. What I mean by the pause is to rethink the traffic light system. I'll set out how I think it should be run in a moment. But this has been a comprehensive failure. Border protection from the Conservatives. And, you know, late to home quarantining, late to border testing, late to hotel quarantining, late to add India to the red list. Now, what I say should happen is this chaos that we've seen, passengers in our airports, whichever country they have come from, green, amber, red, mixing without proper procedures in place, and an amber list where messaging from the government has been, frankly, all over the place. We have some government ministers saying that it is not for holidays, it's for essential travel. Another cabinet minister saying some people would consider holidays essential.
Okay.
So what we have to do...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're very short of time. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just want to know, given that all the data on the variants and the vaccines seems pretty positive this morning, why we should now pause international travel, and crucially, for how long do you think we should pause international travel?
We're not talking about pausing all of international travel. We're talking about pausing very briefly. We're talking a matter of days, if not less, Andrew, to get this right. What I am saying is that the amber list countries should be shifted onto the red list. So you have that comprehensive hotel quarantining. We can then have this green list in place. It's only a very small list. It's got about 12 countries on it at the moment, some of which are not even accepting tourists. And then we can start to build up that green list. But that can be done immediately if the Home Office gets a grip and supports airports in making sure that passengers are kept apart.
And so this depends on hotel quarantining, which is quite expensive. Who pays for it?
Well, clearly the hotel quarantining would be paid for by the passengers. You can have in other countries that have used this, you do have particular concessionary arrangements in place, like loans and other things that deal with particular situations, like, for example, a family member has died, you have to attend a funeral and other things like that.
We're talking about a lot of money here. This is about £1,750 for every traveller. Doing that prices a lot of British people out of travelling at all.
Well, at the moment, it should be clear that with the red list and the existing amber list, though of course I'm saying that should be added to the red list, It should be essential travel only, rather than this mixed messaging that the government's been putting out, which is causing such chaos. Now, it's so important because we are in a race, Andrew, between the variants and our vaccination programme. And what we have to now be doing is protecting the gains of the British people, those hard-won gains after over a year of sacrifice. The greatest threat we face to our unlocking is a variant from overseas that threatens the efficacy of our vaccines. That's why we've got to do everything we practically can to prevent that outcome from happening.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, I'm sorry it's been such a frustrating morning for you, for both of us indeed, but thank you very much indeed for sticking with us and joining us. Thanks so much indeed. And thanks to everybody for watching, all the rest of my guests as well, of course. I will be back like a bad penny next week at 9 o'clock. Goodbye.